All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Legal AF with Court Accountability Action. I'm Lisa Graves from Court Accountability, and I'm so excited today to be here with my colleague, Mike Sachs from Court Accountability. We want to talk with you about what's happening with the courts and the fight back against some of these extreme measures being put forward by Elon Musk and others. So without further ado, Mike, can you tell us what you've been watching and what you think is significant or most significant today about what's happening with DOGE?
Yeah, Lisa. So I've been watching everything,
Yeah.
all the lawsuits, all of them, every little bit. But we'll talk about what's happening today. So today there were two big decisions that came down from the district courts. They may be appealed, but right now they're in their current moment at the lower courts. One, as you mentioned, is about DOGE. Now, over the course of the last couple of weeks, there have been a slew of lawsuits trying to prevent DOGE, the DOGE bros, the people who are going into the various administrative agencies, trying to access people's personal information and fire everybody, all that. Well, there have been a bunch of lawsuits against them from various plaintiffs trying to limit their access to these personnel records that could perhaps open up personal information to virtually every American because
Right.
a lot of the agencies have those. Yes, Lisa, what are you saying?
No, I said right. That's exactly right.
Right.
The concern about all of our information being accessed by people who have unusual nicknames, are not ordinary government employees, may not even have the security clearances that most people have, and yet have access to systems that have traditionally had deep measures to protect against inappropriate access, fraud, or misuse. And so it's just a hugely important issue, Mike. Sorry to interrupt.
No, thank you for adding that context there. I get in my sort of factual presentation of what's in the documents before me, but what you just said there is exactly why these lawsuits were filed. So the decision that came down today was from Judge Deborah Boardman. She's in Maryland, and she's already blocked Trump's citizenship stripping executive order, the birthright citizenship narrowing against the 14th Amendment order. She's blocked that already. This is the second big order she's handed down against the new Trump 2.0 administration. And in this case, the American Federation of Teachers, the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers, and a bunch of other unions, as well as a bunch of individual plaintiffs, all sued the administration, specifically the Office of Personnel and Management and the Education Department and the Treasury Department, to stop the DOGE bros from accessing the information in those agencies' systems. What Boardman did today was she blocked the DOGE bros. I like using that term. I know there might be DOGE sisses in there as well, but I'm just going to go with it. Right. And she blocked the DOGE folk from accessing information from the Education Department and from the Office of Personnel and Management. She did not block the effort to access the Treasury Department's records, but that's not because she didn't think there was a case. But it's more because another federal judge on Friday, Judge Vargas in the Southern District of New York, did that for Treasury. Now, this decision comes after a bunch of other courts have either refused to get involved or said that there wasn't much of a case against DOGE, or the plaintiffs didn't have standing. So there are a couple of judges in D.C. that said that over the past couple of weeks, both Democratic and Republican appointees, another judge in Virginia as well. So there's a bit of a split going on in the lower courts, and these are going to work their way up towards the appeals courts, if not towards the Supreme Court. So that was the big decision, one of them that came down today.
Well, that was a great recap. I wonder, with some of the different opinions, of course, some of that depends a lot on how they pleaded the case. Like, what is the particular act that the plaintiffs or the parties say is being violated? The thing that's been just astonishing to me, and I'm a natural smiler even in the midst of terrible times, just because you got to seize, I suppose, the joy where you can. But it's also I've been known to, it's sort of gallows humor in terms of just the hysterical awfulness of it. But, I'm not happy about what's happening. In fact, I think what's just been mind blowing is it's been, now more than 30 days with day after day and almost hour by hour transgressing of rules and norms, procedures, regulations. I'm astonished in some ways by just how rapid fire this effort has been to destroy and or violate longstanding rules or just dictate, hey, I'm here and our people get access, and if you don't give us access, you're going to get threatened by another Trump lawyer, who's a loyalist or what have you, for not following our command. But I wonder whether in this particular case, there's anything about the type of claim that was made, about access to the education department records or access to these other records that you think made it stronger, maybe, or was maybe well pleaded, or somehow gives a sign of hope that this decision will stand.
Yeah, it's still a bit too early to tell based on all the various things being thrown at us. But ultimately, Judge Borman did say that the plaintiffs showed a likelihood of success on the merits of their claim that these actions were not in accordance with law.
Yeah.
As you said before, some of the other cases were thrown out because the plaintiffs either couldn't say that they actually were tangibly injured by the actions that the DOGE bros took. It was too speculative at this point, or because the court might have ruled that there wasn't a likelihood of success in the merits because their claims simply did not rise to the level of illegality. Now, Judge Boardman otherwise said that there was a Privacy Act issue here as well, and that she also said that none of the exceptions were met under the Act's bar on disclosure. So there are certain elements here that could be stronger than others, but this is all going to shake out as it goes up the chain. Right now, the Boardman's TRO, temporary restraining order, goes until March 10th. It will be reviewed as it gets closer to that point on whether she will keep the order and convert it into a preliminary injunction or not. But one thing you're talking about the rapid pace of all of this. What we're seeing here, not only in the cases about Doge's access to personal information and Musk's trying to fire people and Trump's ordering the entire federal government to answer only to him as opposed to having some independence and to look out for consumers and workers, is an attempt to really reorder our constitutional understanding from day one. It's this rapid fire attempt to not just upend how we've understood our federal government to work, but also, I think, trying to make good on this idea of run the government like a business, which we've heard for years on end. And there's always been anger that the government is not being run like a business. Well, right now we're starting to see it run like a Trump business, or as Musk's takeover of Twitter, which we saw through public reporting wasn't the best way to run a business. So we'll see again how this all shakes out legally, but also practically. We're already seeing practically how it's having an impact on federal workers and others dependent on federal aid throughout the country. People showing up to Republican town halls across the country in Oklahoma, in Georgia, angry. Idaho, angry. Yeah. People who aren't necessarily Democrats or people who aren't necessarily anti-Republican or whatever, but just people affected by this slash and burn attempt to, again, run our government like a business going into the ground. Yeah. So the other big case that came down today that I do want to highlight is an immigration-based case. So the Department of Homeland Security, pretty early on in Trump 2.0, issued a new guidance document for ICE agents on where they can and can't raid for undocumented immigrants. And they lifted this long-time ban on going into sensitive locations, as in houses of worship, where people might seek safe harbor. Under a 2021 memo from then Secretary Mayorkas, he upheld this ban on ICE agents going into houses of worship, except for limited circumstances. And those limited circumstances included a national security threat, imminent risk of death, violence, or physical harm to a person, a hot pursuit of an individual who poses a public safety threat, a personally observed border crosser, an imminent risk of evidence material to a crime that will be destroyed, or a safe alternative location does not exist. That wasn't a complete list, but those are the ideas of limited circumstances in which ICE agents could enter a house of worship to obtain someone they believe is not in the country lawfully. Now, that itself was a bit narrow, was a bit broader than advocates would have preferred. They would want someone to have a clear warrant to come into those as well. That was not part of the 2021 action, but that still was not good enough. Those limited circumstances of access were still not good enough for the new Trump administration. They rescinded pretty much all limitations on access to houses of worship for ICE agents and DHS in general. a bunch of Quaker organizations that represent hundreds of Quaker meeting houses around the country, an organization represented Baptist churches that's based in Georgia, as well as a Sikh temple I believe in California. They sued the DHS in a federal court in Washington, in Maryland. And today, that judge issued also an order saying that Trump administration cannot go forward with that policy in houses of worship and restore that 2021 policy. Now, it was a partial win for the plaintiffs because they were seeking to make sure that the Trump administration couldn't enter any house of worship even without limited circumstances, and they must have a warrant to go in. The judge did not go that far in his injunction, nor did he accept the nationwide scope that the plaintiffs were asking to stop this across the country, no matter who was affected, not just the plaintiffs who were affected. So the judge gave a win on the relief to the Trump administration, but on the merits to the plaintiffs. So this, I would say, at least in this current environment, is a very good. It's a very good result to protect, and could also be extended to other affected individuals and organizations as this goes up the chain.
Yeah, it really is extraordinary when you think about the most fundamental rights that our Bill of Rights protects. The requirement that the people many centuries ago, in terms of ratifying the U.S. Constitution, they insisted that there be a First Amendment, which expressly protects the freedom of worship. And so that's been considered in U.S. history to be one of the most fundamental freedoms in terms of freedom of conscience, the ability to worship and not have that worship intruded upon by law enforcement. In fact, that freedom has been extended in a lot of ways that, some people have felt, is controversial, like churches aren't taxed, even though some churches are extremely wealthy, have amassed enormous wealth. They don't have to file public tax filings to show what their revenue or expenses is. And we've had this U.S. Supreme Court with Roberts really trying to use their freedom of worship as a sword in order to attack anti-discrimination laws. So on the one hand, you have this sort of recent trend of expanding freedom of worship in ways, in particular in these ways to take down anti-discrimination laws, or to allow, this football coach, for example, to worship on the field, even though that, in my view, is coercive to those kids who might feel
or perhaps let Oklahoma publicly fund in its entirety a Catholic sectarian charter school, or another case coming up to try to have a state force the 10 Commandments in the Bible in public schools in Louisiana.
Right. So you have this one trend that is really aggressive in trying to advance a more theocratic society, in essence, or use the law and our tax dollars to really fund religious indoctrination of people, regardless of their own faith or their parents' faith. And then here, in this instance, you have this determination or this effort, this edict to transgress longstanding, although the rules that were challenged here or that were set aside here were in 2021, but they're on a bedrock of longstanding rules about the idea that we do not have ICE agents or Border Patrol agents just invading people's churches, invading places of worship in order to search for people. And so it does seem really extraordinary, that contrast between
that tension, Lisa. I want to mention also that tension you talk about is existing before the Texas Supreme Court right now, because Attorney General Ken Paxton wants to find people in this country without documentation, wants to find immigrants wherever they may be. And you have some very prominent religious right organizations that are representing, in this case, the undocumented immigrants who are, or rather the religious organizations that seek shelter and provide shelter for undocumented immigrants. So this is a tension that's happening on the right within that movement as well. And that's also a curious thing to see how that will play out.
That's right. Some of the longstanding providers of support and assistance for immigrants has been Catholic Charities, which in recent years, not Catholic Charities itself, but the Catholic sort of elite have been more aligned with the Republican Party, Leonard Leo, and all in a lot of judicial appointments, issues, and the related. But here you have an instance in which that, or at least a portion of the Catholic Church, is devoted to that longstanding mission of helping people in need, and they're being criticized for trying to protect immigrants and protect those freedoms.
And in fact, just last week, talking about these cases, just last week, a federal judge did deny the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops' request to unfreeze funds that were headed to their own services under the relief or the refugee assistance program under the federal government. So you're having these fissures of what typically, at least again in these elite legal areas, are between allies. Now you're seeing some fissures based on the priorities of this administration versus those who, in at least legal circles, may have been its supporters in other ways. But Lisa, I want to talk about one more thing before we go,
Okay. Yes,
which was something that happened at the end of last week. The very first of the Trump 2.0 lawsuits hit the U.S. Supreme Court. And this is a case from a man named Hampton Dellinger. He was the head of the Office of Special Counsel, not to be confused with Jack Smith's special counsel or all the special counsels we've had within the Justice Department going back many, many years. He headed this office, which is dedicated to protecting civil servants and whistleblowers in their complaints against mistreatment or what have you within the federal government. Now, he, upon Trump coming into office, Trump fired Dellinger. Now, the problem is the Office of Special Counsel, the head of it, has statutory protections from acts of Congress preventing just the firing of the head of this agency. Rather, right, there needs to be a certain level of cause to do so, to insulate him from the political winds and to keep a measure of independence on behalf of the federal workers who are trying to fight for fairness within the government. So Trump fired the guy. And that wasn't just a willy-nilly thing. That was a legal test case because the Office of Special Counsel is one of the remaining independent agencies with a single head that has not yet been undermined by the unitary executive theory at the Supreme Court. Now, what am I saying, all mumbo jumbo? The Supreme Court has been a willing partner in what the Trump administration is now trying to do to bring every part of the federal government, even the independent parts of the executive branch, under the sole control of the president. It's been a project going on for, Lisa can tell us more precisely when it rose, but especially under the Roberts Court, it's been a big mission. And over the past 5 years, the court has gone more aggressive in how it's been enforcing this notion of the unitary executive theory. So this is the latest step, and this is an attempt by the Trump administration to bait the head of the OSC to bring this lawsuit so that the Supreme Court will ultimately say, yep, unitary executive theory, you can fire whoever you want. It doesn't matter how independent they are. And that's where this is looking like it's going. And so far, the lower courts have sided with Dellinger because the Supreme Court precedent is not yet on the Trump administration's side. So the Dellinger wanted the district court. Then he won when Trump asked the DC Circuit to stay that ruling. DC Circuit said no. And with one Trump appointee from the first term dissenting, and then they went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, by looked like a vote of 7-2, but you never quite know who's on or who's off in these shadow docket cases, said we're just going to let this temporary restraining order play out until it expires in a few days. I think it expires later this week, and until then, we're going to hold our hand. But really, when this gets back to the justices, we can expect them to say that Trump wins. Until then, we have a weird standoff because Dellinger has been court-ordered back to head up the OSC, whereas Trump says and the DOJ says, no, we put our new guy in. We have the acting head of OSC in there, former Representative Doug Collins, now with the Veterans Administration. So we have this weird standoff now. We're waiting for a change in the law that's inevitable from the Supreme Court.
Well, it really is extraordinary what's been happening. And I really appreciate your underscoring that last point, Mike, because we have a Supreme Court, this Roberts Court, that has been packed by the far right, packed by Leonard Leo with, obviously the Trump appointees on that court. And they have been working to reverse not just recent law, as we've seen, as recently as Dobbs, law that's 50 years old, but law that's coming in on nearly 100 years old in terms of the independence of agencies. And, in some ways, this may sound like, a sort of abstract debate because it's like, oh, unitary executive theory, independent agency. But this is really about whether an agency that has been tasked by Congress under federal statute, signed into law by a president to do certain things to investigate and protect the interests of the American people can just be unilaterally, arbitrarily, capriciously fired by a president and then have that president install whoever he wants, basically to answer to him and not necessarily to the law. And so these are fundamental issues, but it is concerning, certainly with John Roberts at the helm of the Supreme Court and with the SELA law case a few years ago. They signaled that they are ready to destroy the independence of some of the remaining independent agencies. And so we are at great risk that this court will ultimately allow that firing and other firings to go forward in ways that really damage, in my view, civil society, damage the ability to enforce the laws as written versus as dictated, in essence, by a president or his men or his DOGE bros or whomever they decide to put into power. But the other thing I just wanted to flag, two things just in response to what you said earlier, Mike. One is this idea of government being run by a business. It's been on my mind for many years now, actually, because I actually think many businesses are not actually run very well. They're run like dictatorships. There's a guy, particularly family-owned businesses or, sole control, but like a Trump business. The guy at the head just makes whatever decision they want. There's no democracy. There's no process that has to be followed. It's just really, someone says, like in The Apprentice, you're fired. That's it. There isn't process. But the government doesn't work that way. The government is these institutions that we as citizens have invested in with our tax dollars for years to build up these, sort of reservoirs of protection for the public interest. And the idea that these thousands of workers, civil servants, whether they're at USAID or other agencies, the Defense Department, the FBI, these are people who've devoted their lives to serving the American people, to serving the public interest, or USDA, whatever, park rangers. They're just being arbitrarily and capriciously fired without cause by themselves, nothing that they've done wrong, in pursuit of this really extreme agenda. And it's very frightening to think that this court, whether it's through this challenge by Mr. Dellinger or others, will ultimately allow this sort of extreme action, just arbitrary, damaging, destructive action by a president in disregard of longstanding personnel rules, the rules for employment, the determinations of agencies to fund, of Congress to fund these agencies, that we will just have sort of a dictatorship in the form of Trump is really, I think, frightening, and is one of the reasons why I don't think government should be run like a business. Government should be well run to serve the public interest in accordance with the laws. And that leads me to one other point, and then I'm going to toss it back to you before we wrap, which is in 2016, after Trump was elected, I got a call from National Public Radio about the rule of law. People were like, what's going to happen in that first Trump term? Will the rule of law stand? And fortunately, in many ways, the rule of law held in that first term. And now we have a different Supreme Court. We have different lower courts, more Trump appointees. But at the time I told the interview on Marketplace, I said, the rule of law is a really slender reed, and it depends on having people in power who are willing to assiduously follow the law, because it's actually very hard to enforce in the face of powerful people disregarding it. And I never thought I'd see a second Trump administration, but here we are. And we have just an extraordinary a level of transgression of ordinary rules, including, as you began this conversation, trying to remake the 14th Amendment unilaterally without an amendment, without a constitutional amendment, to basically say something other than what it says. And that's just one of probably, we're up to certainly hundreds, if not 1,000 instances in just 30 days. So I'm not sure if you have any encouraging words to help us conclude with, or any other thoughts, Mike, but let me pass it to you before we wrap.
And ultimately, this all comes down to we the people, right? We talk a lot about the courts. The courts won't save us here. Even the instances in which the Supreme Court will try to stop Trump, whether or not he listens, I'd say with the birthright of citizenship executive order, that's a likely one. Even when they do, remember that it's because of the Supreme Court, the John Roberts Supreme Court, that we're even in this place in the first place, allowing Elon Musk to buy his proximity to the presidency, if not the presidency itself, allowing the certain levels of democracy deterioration to get us to the point of our anti-democratic moment. And also then, of course, allowing Trump to claim the powers of a king to avoid prosecution, to help him continue to stay on the ballot despite his insurrectionary behavior, to ultimately put him in the position to win this presidency a second time. So if the leopard eats the Supreme Court's face, well, that's not just their problem, because it could take us all down with it. And it's up to us to stay vigilant, up to us to hold fast to our democracy, and up to us to make sure that we emerge from this stronger and better than ever before.
Yeah, those are great words, Mike. And, those town halls where we're seeing ordinary people standing up and speaking out, they're so heartening to see how people understand how this is affecting them and their lives and their communities. And so just a great joy to work with you, Mike. One of my great joys in the midst of these difficult times is to work with you and Alex and others on the team. And to all of you who tuned in, thank you so much. Please like, subscribe, and share. This is Legal AF with Court Accountability and the Midas Touch Network. And just so happy to have you join us. And thank you, Mike, for coming on.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.